Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So today we're on the unit on American Cultural Revolution, really from 1953 to 1980. Basically every day is almost like an entire mini course on the different aspects of society and how it changes. Today, we're going to talk about the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1950s and the 1960s. Let's go ahead and get started. You got to start here with Brown versus Board of Education with the civil rights movement in the 1950s. Now, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 had legalized segregation. It was like the worst possible outcome for black people, even though Homer Plessy, the black guy, had actually won it. There is a big push for equality after World War II because, again, not only the Tuskegee Airmen, the Buffalo Soldiers, African Americans had really gained a lot of respect and clearly showed that racism is stupid in the United States in World War II. After World War II, there is a push, because after World War II, America expected to go right back to having black people as second-class citizens, and the black community is going to stand up and say, no, not a thing that's going to happen. The country collectively is going to start understanding this is wrong and we have to start correcting this. So we're going to start today with Brown versus Board of Education is the cataclysmic Supreme Court case that's going to get all of this set in motion here. So everybody was segregated, especially in the South. Black people and white people completely legalized under Plessy versus Ferguson. The bigger issue, all right, as far as segregation, and the idea was separate but equal, but separate was inherently not equal, which is what Brown versus Board of Education is going to point out. This is, now granted, this is about 13 years before Brown versus Board of Education, but this is a all-black school in Georgia in 1941. I guarantee you the all-white school is a lot better than this. All right. So it was obvious that by segregating races in the South, it was the haves and have-nots. So Brown versus Board of Education follows the story of this little girl, Linda Brown, who happened to live in a school district which was not common at the time because there's the black school in the middle of the black district, because if you were black, segregation was so intense, if you were black, you couldn't live on the white side of town. If you were white, you couldn't live on the black side of town. So there's a black school in the black community and a white school in the white community. Well, in Kansas, this little girl and her family happens to live on the white side of town. The laws were a little more lax in Kansas. But she wasn't allowed to go to the white school. She had to go to the black school. So she had to travel all the way across the white side of town early in the morning to get to the very edge of the black side of town to take a bus to get to her black school. It would take her hours and miles of walking, this little girl, just to get to school because she's black when she lived right next to an all-white school. The Supreme Court's going to take this up because schools are taxpayer funded. So they're public institutions. The Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education, not only do they rule this is bullcrap and she should be able to go to whatever school she's closest to, they ruled 9-0. 9-0, that just doesn't happen at the Supreme Court. So not only is the Supreme Court going to rule in favor of her, it's unanimous. This is a touchy subject, and it's unanimous, overturning the Plessy versus Ferguson, a clear-cut precedent from 1896. This is a very telling side that the federal government, at least, is moving forward and progressing in this idea that we should not be treating American citizens differently. So this is a picture of Linda Brown with her mom holding the newspaper saying the court bans segregation in schools. Well, segregation's over. I guess the lesson's over. No, not at all. You're actually going to see a huge backlash to this. So while it's not an immediate change, that's really not going to happen until the 1970s with busing and making sure schools, you take people from the black community and white schools and like forcefully integrate. Really all that's happening now is whatever school you live closest to, you go to. Well, this really keeps the black schools almost all black and the white schools almost all white because white people live closest to, live in the white community and black people live in the black community. This doesn't end segregation. I need to point that out. This just talks about schools. This is what the federal government can control. Taxpayer funded stuff. Private businesses can do whatever they want still. So segregation still exists. But there is a huge backlash, and you see a ton of racist backlash to the Brown versus Board of Education ruling because people don't want to go to school. There's a lot of people who don't want to integrate schools. They don't think black people and white people should go to school together. So those that do try and that live in areas where they're going to, especially black kids going to white schools, you see crazy like pushback from it. Little Rock, Arkansas. Immediately, there's 9 kids try to go to Little Rock, Arkansas. They send in the paratroopers to make sure they can go to school together. So while Brown versus Board of Education is wildly historically significant because it shows the federal government is basically done with segregation, the American population and racism doesn't end because of a court ruling. And that is why the civil rights movement is actively going to point out and fight against racial bias in society and have the federal government kind of step in and help as much as possible. So the question here is, how did Brown versus Board of Education change the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling, and what was significant about the ruling? So pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. All right, so there's this woman, Rosa Parks. I really hope that you've heard of her before. If you haven't, it's fine. I'm going to tell you the story. But hopefully this at least rings a bell. All right. So Rosa Parks is an African-American woman in a town called Montgomery in Alabama. All right. So in Montgomery, Alabama, the buses are segregated. White people sit at the front, black people sit at the back. All right. Now, a lot of things are segregated. Restaurants, all types of stuff are segregated. The buses, however, are a particular point of contention among African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama. Really anywhere where the buses are segregated. Because, again, segregation basically means it puts black people in an inferior position. And you might be thinking, well, black people sitting back, white people sitting in the front, it's half and half, right? Is there a problem sitting in the back versus the front? There's a couple, that's not what it is. So let me paint a picture for you here. So, who rides buses? People who don't have cars. Typically, people who can't afford a car ride the buses. So it's usually the poorest part of the community uses the public transportation. Black people aren't allowed the same jobs that white people are and are not paid as much as white people a lot of times for the same job. So black people are the poorest part of the community pretty much everywhere in the South. So the buses, like 85% of the people that ride the buses are black. Without the African American community, the buses don't exist. Like they can't make money. So number one, the buses should cater to the African American community since that's who pays them. But they don't. They segregate them. The rule is you can sit in the middle, even near the front of the bus if you're black, and it's fine as long as there's not white people on the bus that have like pushed you back. So like you can sit like 3 rows back, and that's fine as long as there's only like a couple white people in front of you. But if those front rows fill up, black people have to move to the back in order to take over the back half of the bus. This is what happens to Rosa Parks. She's sitting in a place that she is allowed to sit. Or she doesn't sit down in the front. And they're like, she sits where she's allowed to, but the bus fills up in front of her, and the bus driver, who she's had problems with before, tells her to move further back. She says no, all right? It ends up being a huge situation, and she ends up being arrested for refusing to move and give her seat to a white person. I want to be very clear here. Rosa Parks is not the first or the last black person to be arrested for sitting in a white-only section of the bus. However, the reason this one's so famous and the actual bus that Rosa Parks gets arrested on is in a museum now, and on that bus, they literally have, hey, here's Rosa Parks' seat where she said, nah, I ain't gonna move. There's a reason it's Rosa Parks, all right? And here is a picture of her getting fingerprinted. You think it's odd that maybe the news showed up and took a picture of this girl getting arrested? Well, she also wasn't the only one that got arrested. 3 other people got arrested at the exact same time. You don't even know their names. I don't even know their names. I could Google it, but I don't know the names off the top of my head. But I know Rosa Parks. Here's why. Rosa Parks is a secretary of the NAACP in Montgomery, Alabama. She has been fighting for equality for black people in Montgomery, Alabama. This has already been an issue with this particular bus driver. She takes the same bus every day. So when she gets arrested for this, the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is a national organization trying to fight against this discrimination, is alerted, and they basically make it national news that, hey, this black woman got arrested in Montgomery, Alabama for being black and sitting on a bus. This is something that would be crazy to somebody that lived in Washington State or Montana or Connecticut. They're like, what? People can get arrested for being black on the wrong side of the bus? So when Rosa Parks, because she's already well known in these parts for being part of the NAACP, when she is arrested, it makes a bigger news, and the NAACP is going to come down from like New York City, the type of people to come down to Montgomery, Alabama, and kind of choose Montgomery, Alabama as a battleground because the busing situation in Montgomery irritates black people, and this is a good time to do it. And Rosa Parks was already well known, and that's why she was so famous. She was already well known in the NAACP. So the question here is, what was it about the buses in particular in Montgomery, Alabama that made African Americans so upset about the fact they were segregated? Like, so what about the busing situation irritated black people the most in Montgomery, Alabama, more so than separate diners and things like that? So pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. All right, very famous dude here, Martin Luther King Jr., all right? Hopefully you've heard of his name before. His holiday is named after or used for his birthday. So this is Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. is rightfully as famous as he should be due to what he does in the civil rights movement. It kind of starts out with luck. So Martin Luther King Jr., this Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he has his doctorate in divinity from Boston College. He is a preacher. So when all those NAACP bigwigs come down from New York City down to Montgomery, Alabama, they're like, hey, if we boycott the buses will basically shut down because they have to make money off African Americans, and they will reverse their segregation ruling. So all these bigwigs from New York City are like, all right, everybody, don't ride the bus. And people in Montgomery, Alabama is like, no sir, Yankee, we're not doing that. So even though these are black people from NAACP coming down, the black community is still like, nah, you some northerner. Like, we'll just lose our jobs because we can't get to work. So the NAACP realizes that they have no pull here in Montgomery, Alabama. They have to find somebody that will organize this bus boycott and see if they agree to it. This preacher, Martin Luther King Jr., happens to be a very popular preacher in town in Montgomery, Alabama. That's pure coincidence. They go to him and they say, hey, would you be willing to lead this boycott? Now, Martin Luther King Jr., incredibly famous in American history, and rightfully so. One of the things that is really just kind of eliminated from history, you don't ever really hear it, and I think Martin Luther King Jr. would be upset if he today, he gets assassinated in 1968. If he was alive today and saw how he is taught in history, one thing that would upset him is we don't talk about the fact that he was Christian. Everything he does is Christian based from start to finish. What would Jesus do kind of mentality, all right? Very much so. We talk about the civil rights leader, this leader of people. He was a Christian first, and he was adamant on that. So the NAACP asked him, and he says, he thinks about it, prays on it, and says, sure, I think this is the right thing. I think this is like what Jesus would do. So he basically commits himself to this bus boycott and tells the black community, which he is very much a leader of in the Montgomery town, to boycott the buses. So when the NAACP said it, nobody listened to him. When Martin Luther King Jr. says boycott the buses, people walk to work. This was big. This was huge because people did lose their jobs, but they also learned how to carpool, do this other stuff. It was detrimental to the buses as well. All right, so much so, and the white community, which is what runs everything, they actually arrest Martin Luther King Jr. And this is his mugshot. He gets arrested for it's something ridiculous. It's like a 1921 law, conspiracies that interfere with lawful business. It's ridiculous. But they arrest him and put him in jail for this because they're so angry that the buses are losing money because of him. While he is in jail, he writes the letter from Birmingham jail. Basically, he decides here, I think this might be my calling. Like the civil rights movement, I think this is, what, Jesus has put me here. Again, everything is Christian-based for Martin Luther King Jr. And while he's in jail, he really kind of solidifies that I don't think I'm going to go back to being just a preacher after this. I think I'm going to, model, equality and be a big part of the civil rights movement after this. So he gets out of jail, the boycott ends, and it is a massive victory for black people in the South because they showed through nonviolent means they were able to get the buses to stop segregation. And that's what happens in Montgomery, Alabama. It is a massive victory. It's exactly what they wanted. Buses are no longer segregated. People start riding the buses again, and the movement is going to quickly spread. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. is never the head of the NAACP. I don't even know if he's a member of the NAACP. He's going to work closely with them, but he creates his own group called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He doesn't dislike the NAACP, but since it's not a Christian organization, he's not, he wants to make sure, again, everything is Christian based. So he creates his own group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which says, yeah, we're going to fight for equality, but we're going to do so in nonviolent means. The nonviolence is the cornerstone of a lot of the changes that are going to take place here. So the question here is, while there were many leaders in the civil rights movement, what was it about Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent protest that ended up leading to the most change? So, and we're going to talk about more nonviolent protest here. If you use violence for change, it just looks like to the people, like you have to get white people on your side because white people in the other part of the countries have no idea what's happening in the South. And they're like, black people are being treated like as second-class citizens. Why is that? And then if they see that it's white people and black people are just fighting each other, we're like, well, that's why they have to be segregated. They can't get along. If black people don't use violence, they know eventually white people probably will. That will make the white people the bad guys. And that's exactly what happens in these nonviolent protests. If you use violence, it just solidifies the idea that the two races should be separate. You cannot use violence, and that is a huge part of what Martin Luther King Jr. preaches. So let's talk about some of these nonviolent protests. So Martin Luther King Jr., he's not everywhere all at once. So there's a lot of groups that take his nonviolent message and they spread it out around the country. All right. The most famous, and these guys, all right, from Shaw University, is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, nicknamed SNCC. Shaw University in Raleigh at the time was an all-black college. Now it's a historically black university. They go to Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is actually just right down the road from where I'm recording this from. In Greensboro, North Carolina, they are going to go and they're going to have a sit-in. Now, there's a handful of reasons that they're going to choose this. Number one, you do it in North Carolina. I mean, that's where they were already. North Carolina is segregated, has all the same rules. They know they're going to get the reaction they want. But they do it in North Carolina because they're not going to be lynched like could happen at this point in Alabama or Mississippi if you do this in the wrong area. They're not going to do it in New York City because there's no segregation in New York City. So they choose Woolworths. So Woolworths, you might not be familiar with this store. This is the Walmart of the 1950s. It goes out of business in large part because of the bad publicity this is going to cause them over time. So inside every Woolworths, there's a diner. Just like inside of Walmarts, there might be a Subway or a McDonald's or something inside like those big mega Walmarts. So there's a diner in it. The rule is in the diner, only in the diners in the South, because Woolworths are in every town in the entire country, north, south, east, and west, all right? But they're only segregated in the South. In the South, the rule is you can go to a diner and get food to go, but you can't sit down and eat if you're black. So these four guys, they show up, it's called a sit-in. They're gonna go sit at this counter and they're gonna refuse to leave until they're served. Basically, knowing what's going to happen. Sure enough, what happens, and so this is the only picture I have of these guys right here, but it's so popular, it's so effective here. it gets modeled all over the place. So I'm going to show you other pictures of kind of the results, what happens when you do these sit-ins, but these aren't from this story. White people start showing up and harassing them and beating them and pouring drinks on them and cussing at them and spitting on them, shoving them, and beating them up. And the people at the counter don't fight back. If you're knocked down, you get up, you sit back down. I mean, these people are spitting on you, putting cigarettes out on you, just horrific treatment. But they say, we were not going to leave until we're served, knowing they're not getting served. So why would they do this? Well, why is this all blurry? Why is the camera so bad? This isn't a photograph. This is a screenshot from a video because the news shows up and records it. That's big here. The black people are getting beat up. Who's using violence? The white people. The police end up showing up. Oh, thank goodness they're going to put a stop to this and arrest all the black people. And the white people here who are doing the violence don't get in any trouble. So sit-ins spread rapidly because the rest of the country is like, wait a minute. The black people are getting arrested for this? For sitting down? The sit-ins are extremely effective because it starts painting the white people as bad guys because that's all the non-racist people just walk by. The only people that are going to attack are the worst part of society. So this is a color photograph here, and you can just see as they're going in to sit down to do a sit-in, you can tell that it's the stress and anxiety if they know what's going to happen. What's crazy is you can't rely on the newspapers necessarily to tell the truth. So this is a newspaper article of 116 students are arrested for these sit-ins, and it's basically like, oh, it's this awfulness that they were doing. They were, basically making the black people out to be the bad guys. So the sit-ins are really effective. And then there's another situation that is wild, absolutely wild, all right? So as America's like, oh my gosh, we should do something about that, the federal government also makes it illegal to segregate buses on any federal highway, like the interstate highway system that we talked about yesterday that Eisenhower is going to build. Well, since that's run by the federal government says you can't segregate buses on the federal highways. Done. Well, if you get down in Georgia and Alabama, the expectation is you're still segregated. So people are kind of telling the federal government, hey, you can make the law, but they're not enforcing it. And the government's like, I'm sure it's fine. So to prove to the federal government that the South isn't following laws that they pass and you have to enforce it, they have the Freedom Ride. Basically, white students and black students get together on buses and travel down through the South, letting the South know, we're not segregated, what you gonna do about it? It gets crazy. Their buses get stopped, they get beat up, and their buses are set on fire. For riding unsegregated. And the federal government's like, holy crap. You see these guys here in the background in the suits? That's actually the FBI who actually shows up at this crime scene that happens here in Mississippi is where this happens at. And these guys, or the FBI, they show up before the local police. And everybody's like, what? Where's the local police? So they go to the local police sheriff, this guy, Bull Connor, and they say, why did you not send anybody out to help them? They got stopped in the middle of the road. They got beat. It was clearly the Klan was there. This dude says, I didn't help because those N-words got what they deserved. He is on national TV. The president, JFK, watches this. Holy crap. JFK actually makes the comment that he thinks Bull Connor here, this racist sack of crap, just did more for black people than any other white person since Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. The reason he says that is because the whole country is like, this is like for real bad. Like this is unacceptable. Because places white people who have never seen discrimination or because there's not large populations of black people in, again, Montana, Connecticut, Massachusetts, California, are horrified to hear this is what's happening to other civilians in the United States. And the big reason that the civil rights movement is going to move so fast here is because of television. Because all of these experiences that are happening to people are happening on TV. Otherwise, people in Montana and California and Massachusetts, Connecticut would never be exposed to this. You can't read the newspaper articles. Those aren't even accurate. But when you see it on TV, you're like, holy crap. Those people are just trying to march and exercise their First Amendment rights that are given to them in the Constitution, and they're being attacked by dogs, water hoses, being tear gassed. They send out soldiers with bayonets to make sure they don't get out of line. It is wild. But because it's on TV, the whole country realizes this is a problem and it needs to stop. So the question here is, how did television drastically help the nonviolent protest gain national attention and help achieve change? So pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. So two huge things happened here. It's not immediate. Again, I'm jumping over little parts here, but in 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson, who takes over when JFK is assassinated, that he signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is huge. The Civil Rights Act says it's illegal to segregate, period. You cannot segregate people based on race in private businesses. This, there's an argument, is this an overstep? But it was like, no, this needs to happen. Segregation in the United States is illegal. It is huge in 1964. However, there is another big issue that has to be addressed, and that's the ability for black people to vote. Now, if you're like, Mr. Wagstaff, you said the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, talked about this in Reconstruction, Mr. Wagstaff, that gives black people the right to vote. Absolutely. And you're like, and then the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. So not only do black men get to vote, black women get to vote now, right? Correct. Then what's the issue here? Well, the issue is grandfather clauses, literacy tests, and poll taxes are keeping people from voting. To prove this, only like 2% of the people in Mississippi are registered to vote in 1964. And the federal government's like, well, we don't need to do anything about voting. Black people don't even try to register to vote. They don't really want to vote. So to prove that black people want to vote, what they do is in 1964, it's called Freedom Summer. White kids and black students from around, college students from around the country flood into Mississippi to try to get black people to register to vote, because it was actually really hard to register to vote. They tried to see if every single black person in Mississippi would attempt to register to vote. So it's black students, white students coming down together to have this done. What you realize is the literacy tests are impossible. There's literally a situation where somebody tried to register to vote, and the literacy test is they put a bar of soap on the counter and said, how many bubbles are in that? Like, that seems like a joke. That was real. And then, obviously your answer is wrong, and nope, can't vote. After everybody's trying to register to vote, they can't find them. Well, or there's only like 3% registered to vote after everybody tries. Then 3 kids go missing. 2 are white. This is a national outcry. They end up finding them. They had been executed. And again, because 2 of these are white kids, the whole country is horrified about these college students had gone down there. The KKK had executed these 3 guys because they were trying to register people to vote. All right? That signaled enough to the federal government, and they're like, all right, we have to do something about this. So in 1965, once again, Lyndon B. Johnson, Lyndon B. Johnson and Martin Luther King Jr. Show up here. This is them shaking hands because he is signing the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Says you cannot have poll taxes, literacy tests. You can do nothing that tries to stop people from voting. So by ending segregation and making sure black people have the right to vote, these are 2 massive blocks to go towards helping equality move forward in the United States. America, we still have to progress today, but the federal government has taken a very active role with the civil rights movement up to present day to try to prevent any type of discrimination based on color. People's opinions take longer. We have made progress, but we obviously can always be better. So the question here is, explain how the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 help level the playing field for African Americans in the United States. So pause me, answer that completely. See you guys tomorrow.